One summer, I set out to ride from Bergen, a city in the south of Norway, to Tromsø, a city in the north, also known as the capital of the Arctic. I gave myself a month to ride the 2,500 kilometers between these two cities, camping along the way, in the wild as much as possible. After heading in the wrong direction for several days to hike to Tromsø, then taking another detour to ride Atlantic Ocean Road, I made it to the FV17, also known as the Coastal Highway. Starting near the shores of Trondheim Fjord, the FV17 winds along the jagged coastline of Norway for 600 kilometers before finishing in the city of Bergen, perhaps best known among tourists as the gateway to the Lofoten archipelago. Having left the giant cliffs of the south behind, finding flat ground to pitch my tent on was easier than ever. I spent my first night on the FV17 camping in a small pine forest, where I drifted off to the hoots of birds and the cries of reindeer, and I spent my second night on the shores of Foldafjord. After setting up in a clearing dotted with seaweed and mollusk shells, I passed out to the sounds of the lapping salt water. That night, I dreamed of ferries, of sitting beside a radiator, holding warm coffee between my hands, banishing the cold from my bones. When I awoke, I was happy to recall that a half-dozen ferries connected the upcoming fragments of the FV17. I liked the Norwegian ferries a lot. They were frequent, so I rarely checked departure times before arriving at the terminal. I'd just roll in past the queue of cars, join any other cyclists and pedestrians by the ramp, then await the person selling tickets. When the ferry arrived, I'd find a wall to lean my bike against, then head inside to drool over the offerings in the cafe. As well as coffee, the ferries often had hot food, waffles served with jam, or toast with brunost, a brown Norwegian cheese that tastes like caramel. Loaded with a tray of such things, I'd find a seat beside a window, then stare at the water in a sugar-induced euphoria. Most ferries run about every hour between early morning and mid-evening, except in remote locations or when the crossing is long. For example, the ferry from Andenes to Senja takes close to 2 hours and only runs 2 or 3 times per day, depending on the time of year. Norwegian ferries are operated by various companies, so the easiest way for me to look up times was to Google them, or to use a transport-specific search engine like Rome to Rio. At the terminal, departure times are usually listed on the staff cabin beside the ramp. Besides being well stocked and warm, the ferries are relatively cheap. I typically paid between 40 and 80 kroner, about $4 to $8. Of course, more substantial crossings are more expensive. For the 3-hour trip from Bergen to Lofoten, for instance, I paid about 220 kroner, about $21. The Norwegian government would like to get rid of many of the ferries, as replacing them with tunnels or bridges would reduce travel times. The estimate of $40 billion is one reason replacing the ferries is controversial, but it's more than the cost. The ferries are part of the charm of Norway. They're a reason for people to take a break from driving, to stretch their legs, to have coffee or waffles with friends and family, to talk to one another. For cyclists, they're a chance to get out of the rain, to escape the discomfort of the saddle, to meet other adventurers. Undoubtedly, time would be saved by replacing the ferries, but moments would be lost. After that night by the fjord, I retraced my path through the trees, then made my way back up a long, slippery bank to the road. When I set off, I could feel the light rain that I'd only heard in the forest. Gaps in the trees revealed the hazy water of the fjord, where islands of pine floated like wandering ghost ships. For once, I welcomed the rain. It suited this part of the country, I decided, fitted like an old musty jacket. It was only right that somewhere so remote should be shrouded in mist, as if I were cycling along the border of reality. But my tolerance of the rain had diminished by the evening, and I was glad to briefly escape it by boarding a ferry, and by then checking into a modest cabin at a campsite. At 350 krona, almost $35, it was the most I paid for accommodation during my month in Norway. As the campsite's laundry facilities were out of order, I cranked up the cabin's radiator and hob, then hung my soaking clothes and tent wherever I could, on curtain rails and chairs, on the bed and on the table. The next day, now about halfway along the FE17, the roads were flanked by meadow-lined coasts on one side and mountains on the other, and so were often only accessible by ferry. Traffic from the ferries would pass me in short bursts before leaving me alone again with the quiet of nature. By the time I reached Leafjord, the sun had started its partial descent, and I crossed the golden waters of the fjord via the Haugland Bridge, which, with its diamond-shaped towers and array of diagonal cables, seemed like a stringed instrument of the gods. Feeling minuscule upon it, I stopped to look west, where the edge of Norway disintegrates into 1,000 fragments. On the larger islands, the mountains leant north, as if their summits were drawn to the pole. For the next 2 days, I followed the coast, where jagged islands burst through placid waters and occasional villages clung to the shores, scatterings of wooden huts and houses, always painted red and white. For the most part, I had the road to myself. I passed one other cyclist who had ridden from Hamburg, and I asked him whether he was enjoying his trip. Sometimes yes, sometimes no, was his response, which was hard to argue with, and very German. The ocean only escaped my adoring gaze when I rode through tunnels, which was so cold I could feel the change in temperature a while before entering them. The cold was due to more than the mere absence of sunlight, as if they bore through ancient glaciers. I was, after all, approaching the Arctic Circle. The only change in the north side of the line was that it was wetter. Dark clouds shed their ballast on the trees, rocks and road. Water fell silently in thin white lines on the faces of distant cliffs across the fjords. It formed new rivers through the roadside forests. It covered the road and sloshed beneath my tires and drummed on the polyester of my jacket. I met another cyclist at a ferry terminal one day, and we decided to ride together for a while. We were both on our way to Lofoten after all. After catching each other up on our lives to that point, we sped along the coast until we saw an empty beach where we spent the night drinking frozen beer and exchanging stories. The next day, our last on the FE17, we crossed the whirlpools of the Saltstraumen Strait, home to the strongest tidal currents in the world. Then, finally, after a week on the same road, we rolled into Buda. Learning that the next ferry to Lofoten wouldn't arrive until 3 the next morning, we located another empty beach to pass the time on. At this one, a turtle-shaped island swam in water that glistened in that eternal sun of Norwegian summer. It was still early morning when we arrived in Moskenes, a municipality at the southern tip of the Lofoten archipelago. Having barely slept, we rode until we came across a flat patch of grass at the top of a cliff, then quickly set up our tents. Rested, and with the archipelago we had long fantasized about now dappled in light, we marched back to the road. Mesmerized by the landscapes, we pointed out things to each other as we cycled in single file. With our words lost in the breeze, we never quite understood what the other was pointing to, but it didn't matter. "Look," my friend would say, his finger directed towards something in the distance. I'd smile and nod. Maybe it's those mountains he's pointing to, like rows of sharp teeth, or those huts and stilts in the water. "Check that out," I'd say, tilting my head towards sections of the sea, like turquoise glass, so clear you could watch the yellow weeds swaying on the seabed. He'd glance in the general direction, then nod and smile. We parted ways that day, as he had reached his destination and I still had another 600 kilometers until I reached mine. I continued along the coast, watching unreal blues fill sandy coves until I reached Henningsvær. The town was something of a detour, but I'd seen incredible pictures of it and wanted to verify that they were real. Specifically, I wanted to see its football pitch. Well, like any other at ground level, it's from above that the majesty of the pitch is revealed, perched as it is on a rocky headland that projects into metallic Arctic waters. That night, I camped on a nearby beach, where dozens of islets slept in an out-of-place sea. Now near the northern edge of the archipelago, this would be my last night in Lofoten. As I lay in my tent, I thought about my trip so far, the hiking trails to Tromsø, the curvaceous bridges of Atlantic Ocean Road, the teeth-like mountains all around me. But my favourite parts of Norway were yet to come.